Human sacrifice was not acceptable to the Greeks. It may have happened in some contexts, in murky depths of history, but by this point, and this is very controversial, that we really aren't sure, but by this point this no longer happened. And whenever the oracles seemed to suggest that a human had to be sacrificed, this was a matter of a huge amount of hand-wringing and anxiety. In this scene you do see Myrrine and even Kassandra talking back at Spartan men, which is definitely something that other Greeks thought was a fascinating feature of Spartan culture, is that citizen women had more of a say in things, an informal sort of power. Did he just get hit with a tomato? Some basics. Tomatoes, New World crop, didn't exist in Europe at this time. No tomatoes, no potatoes, no peppers, no chocolate, obviously. So welcome to Echoes of History. My name is Roel Koninendijk. I'm an ancient historian at Lincoln College, University of Oxford. I specialize in classical Greek warfare and Spartan history. And I'm here today to take you through the story, the historical context, and the combat styles that you find in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. This game came out in 2018 and it's set during the first stages of the Peloponnesian War. This great conflict that happened at the end of the 5th century BC between Athens and its allies, the Athenian Empire, and Sparta leading the Peloponnesian League, as they fought for supremacy in the Greek world. And I like it that this game has chosen that period, partly because that lets you sort of roam around the Greek world quite a lot fighting these minor conflicts. It shows the importance of mercenaries in those encounters and shows the importance of allied troops and different actors, different allies and agents in the complexity of this patchwork. But also because frankly there's just no pop culture about this period. There is no movie about the Peloponnesian War, there's no movie about Brasidas or about Perikles or about any of these prominent historical figures or what they did, even though the potential for drama is right there. So it's really nice to see someone sort of make an effort to try and bring this period to life. I haven't played this game myself, I have to admit, but I'm very keen to see these clips and to look at the way that this has been reflected in this game. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more, don't forget to like and subscribe.
Don't give in! Let you have it! Got you!
So there's a bit of a time skip in the game, right? So you open with the Persian Wars in 480 BC, and then you skip ahead to essentially Cassandra's childhood, which is, she is the child of Leonidas' fictional daughter. So they skip ahead something like 30 years, maybe, or even more. And then they go ahead to the start of the Peloponnesian War, which is in 431 BC.
Widen your stance. A soldier grounds themselves. Good. Good. Approach me.
There are a couple of things that we need to sort of separate here. Firstly, we do know that Spartan upbringing starts around age 7, but that doesn't necessarily mean that combat training starts that early. So what actually happens is that from that age, boys were put in these sort of groups called herds, along with other boys their age, and were put under the supervision of older boys in order to spend their days together. Now this, in the early stages of their upbringing, very much seems to be about being acclimatized to the Spartan environment, being made to be used to the way that a Spartan is supposed to behave. What these boys actually did together is not really known. No part of it seems to have been about exercise, let alone combat training. This is basically just boys hanging out together and getting up to all sorts of mischief. There is also athletic exercise for girls, but for them it is basically just about physical fitness. For the boys this is also important, but for the girls that's the only thing that matters. The purpose there is essentially eugenic. The Spartans believed that if both parents were healthy and fit, that would produce fitter children. And they also believed that if boys and girls saw each other exercising, essentially it would, in the fantastic euphemism of the author Plutarch, put thoughts of marriage into their heads. Now the important thing about that exercise is that neither the boys nor the girls are ever made to train with weapons. We have zero evidence that Spartans ever trained with weapons, and so what you're seeing in this scene I mean, it may have happened privately. There may have been occasions when parents would want to instruct their children in how to use these things, but that would be strictly off the books. I mean, we have explicit testimony from Plato, for instance, that the Spartans did not bother with weapons training. So they would not ordinarily have learned how to use a spear or a sword, because that is not actually important to being a Spartan, either as a citizen or as a hoplite, as a member of the militia. But who knows what individual Spartan parents might have done, so we can always say that this is simply a creative license.
Inside. The lamb's turning black.
Here. Lay him in his bed.
Yes, Pater.
Kassandra.
Also, what are we wearing?
You are my greatest pride.
It's a very funny feature of all of these scenes that people are wearing armour when there's no reason to wear armour. This guy is just exercising with a kid, and he's wearing greaves, the armour on his shins, full bronze. Why would he wear that just casually, just while he's out in his own, on his own patio?
The oracle has spoken! To prevent Sparta's fall!
So here again, they're taking various things. One is this oracle that I've already mentioned that says that a Spartan king has to die to save Sparta, which was a feature of the Persian Wars. So they're transposing that to a later period for plot reasons, obviously. They're sketching this plot in which the evil conspiracy is trying to snuff out the bloodline of Leonidas. These characters are not historical, by the way. Leonidas' bloodline had already been exterminated at this point, or extinguished at this point, I should say, because Leonidas only had one son called Pleistareus. Pleistareus died without issue, and so the kingship devolved onto Leonidas' twin brother's grandson, whose name is Pleistoanax. So his bloodline was already essentially gone, and the kingship had moved to a cousin. So essentially, the character of a daughter of Leonidas who had her own family, which is the sort of main feature, the main set of characters in this game, is essentially just introduced here for the sake of an original story, which is fine. But they are using different elements of actual Spartan history to try and sort of give depth to that storyline. So here, for instance, the sacrifice of a child. That is not something that actually would happen in Greek religion, I should stress. I mean, human sacrifice was not acceptable to the Greeks. It may have happened in some contexts, in murky depths of history, but by this point, and this is very controversial, that we really aren't sure, by this point this no longer happened. And whenever the oracles seemed to suggest that a human had to be sacrificed, this was a matter of huge amounts of hand-wringing and anxiety. So in conflating these things, they're obviously, giving the villains this role to play in actually murdering a child, which I guess is essentially because they have to look like proper bad guys, and this is obviously what a bad guy would do. So that is why that's why we end up with this a scene of child sacrifice, which is again very un-Greek, and certainly not, probably not even Spartan. So it's a weird kind of scene, but very understandable from the perspective of trying to write a story about some proper villains.
Pater?
Oh, my baby! Kassandra! Kassandra!
The wolf takes no prisoners!
So what we're seeing here is Athenians dressed in blue encountering Spartans dressed in red. This is a game convention. I don't actually know where this starts. We see a lot of different properties using this. It's this game, but also, for instance, the sequel to Rome Total War. Rome 2 Total War uses the same kind of convention, Spartans red, Athenians in blue. Other games do the same kinds of things. Eventually, the sequel to 300 also did this. So in the first movie, of course, the Spartans are wearing red. And so in the sequel, 300 Rise of an Empire, the Athenians are wearing blue. This is purely convention. This is a modern movie convention. This is basically so that you can tell them apart. There is no historical basis for the association between Athens and blue. That is not based on anything. In fact, the Athenians, like the Spartans, quite liked red as a color for the clothes you wore in combat, because they agreed that it was supposed to be a very manly color. It made you look angry and fierce. It intimidated the enemy. According to one source, the Spartans liked to wear red in battle because it hid the bloodstains, so people couldn't see whether they were wounded, so they were more fearsome. This is the kind of thing that's the reason, that's the explanation why the Spartans supposedly favored red, and why their standard tunics, which eventually become a uniform of a sort, are essentially red or purple. And we're not exactly sure how we should translate the phoinike, the clothes that they wear.
See, the Athenian dog Perikles fears you. He cowers in his Parthenon, surrounded by playwrights and sophists. He dares not face you with honor on the battlefield. He knows you are too strong. He knows Athens' days in Margolis are numbered. And he knows Athens is next!
What's funny here as well is that the Spartans are all dressed in full bronze armor still. They have very much the same armor as they wore in the scenes we saw earlier of the Persian Wars 50 years earlier. In that time, as far as we can tell, actually there's quite a bit of change in the way that the average hoplite was equipped. So we see the phasing out of heavy body armor and these face-enclosing Corinthian helmets. The Spartans by this time would have had simple conical pilos helmets, which are becoming standard infantry equipment at this time. And whether they still wore body armor is really open to question. We have no good evidence one way or the other. They may have worn more simple sort of linen corselets, maybe leather. It's not entirely certain whether leather armor was used in this period, or they may have worn no armor at all, which is certainly something that we see a lot in iconography of this time. So depictions of warriors on vases and sculpture often have no armor. They just have the helmet and the big shield. That's the main way in which they protect themselves. The funny thing about battle speeches, we do get them in the sources a lot, but there's been endless debate over whether they're real, whether this could actually happen, especially when you imagine an army of thousands, how could they all hear it? There are different opinions on this, but one thing that we're told actually is that the Spartans specifically didn't go in for these kinds of speeches. They didn't bother with this. And so it's quite funny to see that in this game, both at Thermopylae and here, it's the Spartans who are listening to these speeches when in fact they don't seem to have done that.
I've met Pausanias.
King Pausanias. Really? Kings Pausanias and Archidamos share rulership. Impress them both.
So it's quite funny that they use the sort of modern Greek pronunciations of these words. Obviously, Pausanias and Archidamos, these are modern ways of pronouncing these names. We should actually be talking about Pausanias and Archidamos. It's a hard K sound. But it doesn't really matter, obviously. It just depends on what kind of tradition you grow up in, how you pronounce these ancient words. I always tell my students, don't worry about it. Everybody has their own way of pronouncing these things.
Pausanias and Archidamos share rulership. Impress them both, and your home will be returned to you.
I didn't expect this to be pleasant.
Pausanias, at this point, is actually a member of the family of Leonidas, but somewhat roundabout way. He is the great-grandson of the brother of Leonidas. Am I saying that right? Yes. So he became king after the death of Pleistoanax, who took over the kingship after the line of Leonidas himself died out. So this is essentially somebody who is connected to that family and has taken over the kingship because the initial line had expired. So he is one of the two kings now of Sparta, and the other one is Archidamos, who is of the other royal family. So there are two royal families in Sparta, which can sound a bit odd. Where does that come from? What strange kind of pattern is this? The ancient Greeks already thought it was pretty strange because in most parts of the Greek world, kingship had disappeared. These states had become democracies or oligarchies or other forms of government. Sparta retained its kings. And frankly, we don't know the origin of this system. There are various stories that the ancient Greeks told, but this is essentially lost in the mists of history. They emerge to us as soon as we hear about Spartans, we hear about them having two kings. So we cannot really trace where this idea comes from, and we don't really understand why. It does turn out to be one of the most stable institutions of the Spartan state. So these two kings continue to work alongside each other for centuries, until finally at the end of the 3rd century, through various developments to do with both internal reforms and external pressure from other Greek states, but even the Romans, these houses expire, Sparta falls under the sway of a single king or even a tyrant, and eventually the entire system is abolished. What we do know is that these families presented themselves very much as regular Spartiates, and they had to live and behave as if they were just like the rest. And though in some ways they had certain prerogatives, they broadly had to dress and behave and join the daily life of the other Spartiates. So they didn't stand out in a way of living in palaces and enjoying all sorts of luxuries that weren't accessible to other Spartiates. As far as we know, they lived in normal houses, dressed in normal clothes, ate the same food, and behaved very much in the same way. And some Spartiate kings actually made an effort to show that they obeyed those laws of austerity that applied to other Spartiates. So this is the kind of ways in which the Spartan kings tried to express the fact that they were not exalted above the Spartan state and they were not in charge of it. They were in fact as much servants of the Spartan law and the Spartan institutions like the ephors as all the other Spartans. So this is something that they absolutely had to deal with in their daily life. They were not absolute kings. They did not have, a palace and a court like the kings of Persia. They lived in fairly ordinary ways, and mainly only on campaigns did they have special authority to command others.
Where are the kings?
There. What do you say now?
This is very strange because, of course, what if one of them gets hurt? This is a terrible idea. You don't want to waste your kings this way. But also because these men don't get to decide on policy. If you're talking about something like which troops get sent where, the ephors decide on that. And if you're talking about things like war and peace and alliance, the assembly decides on that. So the kings, while they're in charge of armies, they may be able to set policy. While they're abroad, they have certain authority. But while they're at home, they have to obey the orders of the ephors and the assembly. They absolutely don't get to decide on the kinds of things that are being put in their mouths here, that they get to send additional troops to Boeotia. So there's something very silly going on here, which I can only explain as the idea that because it's Sparta, everything has to revolve around war and fighting. But that is very much not how historical Sparta actually worked. This was very much like other Greek cities, a city or community that solved its internal problems through deliberation and consensual decision-making. That is very much what defines the Spartan constitution just as much as it does the Athenian one, even if the institutions are different and even if who does and does not count as a citizen is very differently decided. And also, again, why are they wearing armor? Obviously, they're wearing armor because they're in a fight. But this guy seems to be just casually wearing armor because he wants to. And he's wearing a gold crown as well, which is not a feature of Spartan kingship. Again, nothing marked these guys out as kings. This is an important thing that actually comes up in their encounters with foreign leaders. They don't recognize the kings because they look like ordinary people, or in fact, they look like people who are so simply dressed that they might be mistaken for vagrants. So there's something very very wrong going on here, which is about projecting our understanding of what an ancient court should look like onto the Spartans where it doesn't belong.
Is that how they solve arguments?
Sometimes.
Archidamos's guard has improved. He should thank me.
Brasidas.
Myrrine is presented here as something like a drill master herself, like she has worked on his guard or something. She's worked on his fighting skill, which obviously relates back to the scene where she was also training Kassandra. But it goes directly against the testimony of the sources that Spartan women in particular were unfamiliar with weapons, because even though they exercised, they never practiced with weapons. And we are told this because when the Thebans eventually defeated Sparta and invaded Laconia, Spartan women proved to be less useful in defense of their territory than other Greek women tended to be because they had no experience of fighting. So the idea that she is, that Myrrine is herself a weapons master in some way goes directly against the evidence that we have.
Let's hear it. My kings, may I present Myrrine, descendant of Leonidas, and her daughter Kassandra.
I heard you'd come back. How dare you step foot on Spartan soil? I should cut it off for what you did.
They helped us secure Corinthia, my king. I beg you to listen.
They are descendants of Leonidas. For that reason alone, they should be allowed to speak. And if we don't like what they have to say, you can chop off any limb you see fit.
Speak, Myrrine. Why?
In this scene, you do see Myrrine and even Kassandra talking back at Spartan men, which is definitely something that other Greeks thought was a fascinating feature of Spartan culture, is that citizen women had more of a say in things, an informal sort of power. They didn't obviously have access to positions of political power, just like in other Greek states. Women were excluded from magistracies, for instance, but they had a lot of soft power by influencing their men, by being willing to stand up to them, both to advise them and to criticize them. So this is something that Spartan women were quite famous for, and that's reflected in this scene, at least by saying these women are not going to be cowed into silence by the presence of the kings or anything. They actually have an opinion of their own, and they're willing to put it out there. So in that sense, I do like it that this scene represents these women as not being meek, and not being submissive in the way that women were expected to be in other Greek communities.
Bring glory to Sparta, and redeem yourself in the eyes of the gods. Until then, neither you nor your mother have a right to your lands.
Tell me what I must do, and it will be done.
She does indeed sound like a Spartan by saying laconically, I can do that if Perikles could do 12 labors. But you want to try and say that in as few words as possible if you want to sound like a Spartan. But it's fun that the game actually does have a sense of okay, you want to sound like a Spartan. That is a thing that you can do.
Confidence of a child who hasn't seen real war.
The Spartans may draw near to our walls, but we must come together now for the glory of Athens.
Glory for you!
Did he just get hit with a tomato? Some basics. Tomatoes, New World crop. Didn't exist in Europe at this time. No tomatoes, no potatoes, no peppers, no chocolate, obviously. Rice and coffee beans also hadn't been introduced to the Mediterranean yet, although they don't come from the New World. There's a lot of these features of the diet that we kind of take for granted. They didn't actually exist in the Athenian diet. So if you wanted to throw something rotten at him, a fig would be the obvious choice, probably. Perikles may have had many reputations, but ruthlessness is not necessarily. He is one of the most influential figures of this period because he essentially controls the Athenian Empire. And this is acknowledged even by authors who really liked him, that he was, in effect, as they call him, the first citizen of Athens. He is the person who has such an influence over the democracy, which is sovereign and which makes the decisions, that he can persuade them to do more or less whatever he wants. Kleon is said to have risen to power after Perikles had died. So in 429, Perikles dies of the plague. Kleon is one of the people who fills the power vacuum. There are various others. There is no historical occasion at which Perikles actually argued with Kleon, because Kleon, it is suggested, would never have been able to rise to prominence while Perikles was still around. People would not have listened to someone like Kleon. There is a bit of a problem with Kleon, is that he's the victim of a very hostile surviving tradition. What you do see here, and what's very fun to see, is that decision-making in Athens is a public affair. The citizens gather on the Pnyx, which is a hill in Athens, which has a little, much smaller in this period, but has a little podium where speakers will stand and address the assembly. And people are there to essentially, vote on decisions, vote on proposals. But it was, of course, accessible only to adult Athenian citizens, male citizens, which is to say only those who were over the age of 18, who were men, who were born to Athenian citizens. So both their father and their mother had to be an Athenian citizen. And those are the only ones who could vote, which excluded the vast majority of the population. All the women, obviously the children, but also, for instance, the metics, the resident foreigners living in Athens who did not have these rights, and especially the enslaved, which are a very, very significant part of the population who had no political or legal rights whatsoever. I like that they make Kleon this sort of shouty man. I don't know why they put him in armour. Again, this is completely inappropriate. But the fact that he has this sort of, both the cadence of a speaker who sort of barks and shouts, but also the kind of motorics which they put in, presumably through motion capture, where he's this kind of moving around. I like that. I like that they gave him a different style of speaking than Perikles. That's very accurate.
We must not become divided!
We are divided, and the Spartans are winning!
terms of close combat, there's really only one warrior type in this world. There is the hoplite, and they're all pretty much uniformly armed and armored, more or less. But when it comes to other troop types, there's a lot more variety. And one of the ways that they actually do try to reflect that is in mounted combat. So you actually do have a guy here who fights on horseback with a bow and arrow. Horse archery is obviously not associated with the ancient Greeks in the sort of public consciousness. We tend to think of this as more of a sort of Central Asian thing and something that the Persians might do, or the Scythians in this time period. But the Athenians in the classical period actually maintained a corps of horse archers. So they actually had a force of 200 horse archers in the city, which they used for the territorial defense and to reinforce their own cavalry forces. So it's quite interesting to see that reflected here. Historically, we don't actually know what they did. We never see them in action. We know that they did serve in various campaigns, but this corps never actually comes into play in a battle narrative or anything like that. What's very interesting about them, though, is that we see the Athenians still support this horse archer corps even after the fall of their empire. So even in the 4th century, they still pay upkeep for these part mercenary, part citizen force of horse archers. So this is a feature of Athenian warfare in particular, which is very nice to see.
Come and get it.
Brasidas is a historical figure. It's a general of the Spartans during the Peloponnesian War, who has the respect of Thucydides for various reasons, one of which is that Thucydides, the historian himself, also served as a general, and Brasidas defeated him. So Thucydides describes Brasidas as easily the best of the Spartan generals who fought in this war. But many of his actions attest to the fact that he was in some ways more energetic, more active, and more willing to think outside the box than other Spartan commanders. And so I quite like that his depiction in this game, he actually has this sort of physicality and speech pattern of someone who has more energy, is more sort of alive to his environment than some of the other figures that we've seen. So he comes across as someone who's sort of young and ambitious and quick thinking, which is very much what Brasidas was according to the best sources we have on him. So he is the kind of figure who might sort of lead a daring charge or run his own ships aground in order to dislodge an Athenian force at Pylos. There are various sort of episodes that he's involved in which he comes across as someone who takes risks, does things that other Spartans won't do, and doesn't always succeed necessarily, but is able to come up with ways in order to try and tip the scales in his favor. So he becomes a very important figure as the 10-year war, the Archedaemonian War, drags on. This early stage, this first stage of the Peloponnesian War, because the Spartans realize more and more that their conventional way of fighting this war, which Archidemos was leading, isn't working. And so they need to find another approach. And Brasidas is always the representative of whatever other approach they come up with. He's always sort of put in charge of that, or is the one who even comes up with it.
I'm in the fight with you. Show courage.
So the plague at Athens, it's a very interesting episode in the fact that it's the earliest time when an epidemic is actually described to us in some detail by a contemporary eyewitness, Thucydides, who was there in Athens when it happened and actually caught the disease, so he knew what happened. And it affected Athens very severely. The losses were immense. As I said, Thucydides and other prominent citizens caught it. Perikles died from it, along with perhaps as much as a third of the population. Something between a quarter and a third of the population died. This was because, they brought it in by ship. This is something that Thucydides seems to be very clear about. He said it started in Egypt. They brought it in by one of the many trade ships that reached Athens. And it spread through the population very quickly because the Athenians had evacuated the countryside and brought the whole population within the walls. And this created conditions of overcrowding and squalor that led to disease running rampant and spreading very easily. At the point when the Spartans discovered that there was this epidemic raging in Athens, they immediately withdrew from the territory and managed actually to avoid causing it to spread to other parts of the Greek world. So this was a particular disaster that struck the Athenians and that caused them immense losses in the early stages of the war.
Thank the gods, Kleon won't see me like this. But that's all I can thank the gods for. They've turned on me.
I hardly recognize it here. It's like the Tartarus.
Athens' fate is decreed. All we can do now is wait.
You should go back inside. You need to rest.
Where I should be is in the Parthenon, my greatest legacy to Athens.
He actually did succumb to the plague, after which Athens had to fill that power vacuum somehow. And according to Thucydides, this was when all their decisions turned bad, because Perikles was the one who kept them on the narrow path of good judgment and good policy, but his successors were not so selfless and not so intelligent, so they weren't able to maintain that. Actually, the difference in policy between Periclean and post-Periclean period is much more difficult to define, and it seems like most of his successors more or less kept to the same kind of ideas.
Yes. I'll go inside. Thank you, Kassandra. Tell my Aspasia I was a good boy and took my drugs.
I will.
Everything you ever created, Athens is mine.
For plot reasons, Perikles is also murdered, which seems surplus to requirements. He's already dying of the plague, which he historically did. But of course, this is where they have to introduce the original character, Alexios, doing this. So that's something they did for that reason. So we skipped ahead many years, actually. So the Battle of Amphipolis takes place in 422 BC. So we're 9 years into this conflict. And in fact, after a period of truce between the two sides. So Brasidas in this scene is I mean, he did die in the battle, but he's sort of outright killed in gruesome fashion. What actually happened was he was fatally wounded, but people drag him to safety, which often happens with people who are wounded in battle, which suggests that there's some room for maneuver there. But he's dragged to safety and hears that he has won the battle before he perishes, which is always this sort of great moment for these generals, that they actually know, like, oh, actually, it wasn't in vain. I did actually win. So that's his sort of moment of glory, when he knows that he has prevailed. And at that point, the people of Amphipolis actually are so grateful for the fact that he warded off this Athenian threat that they throw out their Athenian founder hero, because the founder of a city is often worshipped with heroic cult, so he's given sacrifices in game. They throw out Hagnon and they offer founder games, this heroic cult, to Brasidas instead. So they essentially see him as the refounder of their city because he secured their safety and liberty from the Athenians. And in fact, the Athenians, with a very short exception in the 360s, never get the city back. So they succeed in creating this new independent settlement.
Kassandra, come now. Show mercy.
You turned him against us. My own brother.
We lifted Demos up. We made him great, unstoppable.
This was kind of an awkward moment, but it's really like an awkward moment in history, in the sense that if you want to tell the story as a game, it's a difficult thing that Sparta and Athens never really come to a decisive clash between them. There is no single big pitched battle, either on land or by sea, in which these forces, gather in strength and try to settle the business. There's really only just a number of different proxy conflicts and smaller engagements between the two sides, because it's Athenian policy to avoid that decisive battle, because they think they're going to lose on land, while the Spartans never have the level of naval power that could seriously challenge Athenian fleets. So you're talking about a number of minor encounters and proxy battles that happen all over the Greek world and even into Sicily and Asia Minor that together form a very complex story of war. Thanks very much for joining me as I made my way through Assassin's Creed Odyssey. If you like this kind of content, like and subscribe. You can find more of it here on this channel.